So today is the twins. It's a discussion of twins, error handling and debugging. So these are the kind of two topics that we're covering today. We've got a file to download, product list.xlsm. So go ahead and get that downloaded and get it opened, and that will be our content for today. So what this is a bunch of product data. So this is data that I swiped off of some kind of website for like outdoor goods, you know. So you've got like duck calls, and you've got plaid shirts, and you've got hip waders, and you know, like bows, and I think there's even some firearms in here. But anyway, it's just some data. And the context for what we're going to be doing today is we're going to say, listen, we've got like some categories here. There's only like 4 different departments, but there's no list of the departments. Like if we wanted to do something with data validation to where we had, you know, here's the list of values that are allowed to go in here. Same thing with manufacturer. There's a handful of manufacturers and categories. There may be 100 categories. How much data we have here? About 800 or so items, but only 100 different categories. And so we'd like to be able to say, here is the list of the legal values for category. Here's the list of legal values for department, and so forth. So that's going to be the context of what we're doing as we look at the idea of debugging and error handling. So first, a little background setting for debugging. There's really 3 different categories of bugs. There's the bugs that we refer to as the syntax errors. Syntax error is it's something so bad, you've done something so bad that the interpreter can't even figure out what you're talking about. So, you know, let me just open up a Visual Basic Editor. Let's see, do we already have? Yeah, we got a Module 1 in here. I don't think it has very much going on with it. Module 1, error trap 119. Oh, here it is. So let me go ahead and just make some sub-procedure here, sub-test. All right, so I'm going to say if x is greater than 10, then do something. Dim x as an integer, x equals 11. Okay, so here I've got a syntax error. What's the trouble? Yeah, that should be if. There's no of statement. It's an if statement. And so I've just typed that wrong. So the interpreter is looking at what you did here, or looking at what I did here, and it just says, I have no idea what you mean by that. And so quite often when we write a syntax error, you'll get this red line. And you may get a dialog box pop up that's very annoying. Let's get rid of that dialog box first. That's like the first thing I do when I get a new installation of Excel. Here you go. Tools, options, and the very first checkbox, auto syntax check. Just take that checkbox off. You'll still get the auto syntax. It's still gonna let you know the line's wrong, but it'll just do it by making the line red. It won't put up that dialog box. Yeah, and it used to be that when you hit like the help button for that, it took forever before it would give you no help at all. And it's just, if you ever accidentally hit the help button, it's like, I'm going to go get some nachos or something while I wait for that to come back. All right, so I'm going to change that to if. That's great. So now, do I have any syntax errors in my code? What do you think? I don't have any red lines. Do I still have a syntax error? Well, let's run it, because you can tell if you have a syntax error when you go to run it, it'll say, listen, it'll say compile error. Here's what has to happen. When I try to run this sub-procedure, okay, so kind of back up, I guess, a little bit. So depending on the way that the code that I've written is translated into machine language so it can be executed, we refer to languages as either being compiled or interpreted. In a compiled language, it looks at all of the whole program that you wrote, and when you say, hey, I'm ready to run this thing, it compiles the whole thing into a list of machine instructions. And then you run the machine instructions. That's not VBA. VBA is an interpreted language. An interpreted language, well, depending on the level, it doesn't compile the whole thing. And for VBA, what it does is, you want to run this sub-procedure? Great, we're going to compile just this procedure. And we're not going to make a separate executable file. We're just going to compile it and remember it, and then execute that compiled segment. And so for me to be able to run any part of this sub-procedure, it has to understand the whole sub-procedure. Now, I could have another sub-procedure that's completely crazy. Won't compile at all. That's okay. It's not until I try to call that sub-procedure that procedure will get compiled. So it kind of compiles procedure by procedure as needed. That's why we refer to the piece of software that runs VBA as the interpreter, because it's interpreted code. It doesn't compile the whole thing, it just goes a block at a time. And so when I try to run it, if I get a compile error, that means I've got a syntax error. What's the error? It actually was a pretty good, the statement, the message was pretty good. What does it say? I got a block if with no end if. What am I missing? Yeah, I'm missing end if. I got an if and a then. Now I can have if and then on one line if I put my statement out here, but there's nothing out here. So I got to come in here and put the end if. So now I should be able to run that just fine. I mean, it's not very interesting code, but at least it executes. So that's the idea of a syntax error. Syntax errors, you've got to get rid of them. You can't even run your code until you've gotten rid of them. And they're usually pretty easy to find because the interpreter will, or the editor will give you a hint. Right? It'll make this line red. I just red. I can't figure this out. Or what did it? Let's get rid of this end if and put in like debug.print. Debug.print now. Try to run that. And so yeah, it's not really telling me where the error is, but at least it highlights this and it says I got to here and I couldn't go any further. So it doesn't know where the end if belongs, so it can't tell me where the error is, but at least it gives you some indication. So that's one kind of error. Syntax error, you just got to get rid of it. Now another kind of error, let's skip the next kind of error and go to the third kind of error, which is called a logic error. Logic errors are difficult to track down. And the reason is, as far as the interpreter is concerned, it's no problem. You're telling it to do stuff, and it understands everything you're saying, and it's doing everything you say just fine. The trouble is, you're not telling it to do what you think you're telling it to do. The logic error is, I've written some stuff here, and the problem is up here. It's not doing what I think it should be doing. Well, maybe the problem is in the code, but they're tough to track down because at no point does the interpreter ever have the slightest hint that there's an error anywhere. And so it can't give you any clue. And so for that reason, we have a whole host of debugging tools that allow us to track down and figure out where that error is. We're going to see some of those things today. So that's the debugging portion of today's lecture. The other part of today's lecture is on error trapping. Now, you cannot trap a logic error. You cannot trap a syntax error. You can only trap the third kind of error that we haven't talked about yet, and that is called a runtime error. Here's what a runtime error looks like. Instead of debug.print now, let me print debug.print worksheets. Which worksheet do I want? I want the worksheet called, what do I got to choose from here? Products and promos. Product. Debug.print worksheets.product.name. I want to print the name of the worksheet. Kind of boring since I actually use the name to identify the worksheet and so forth. Okay, are there any syntax errors here? No? I mean, I should be able to compile it. Let's just see if I could compile this. And actually, let me show you one of the debugging tools. One of the debugging tools, you probably come across this before by accident. Like you clicked here in the column and the line turned red with this dot here and you went, oh my gosh, what have I done? You clicked on it again and you went, whew. Well, that thing that you put there is called a breakpoint. The breakpoint says, just before I execute that line, interpreter, stop. And before you execute that line, just take me into break mode. Break mode is the one that's got the yellow bar on it. It says, here's the line I'm getting ready to I haven't executed it yet. I'm getting ready to execute it. And the breakpoint just says, take me into break mode at this point. So let me go ahead and run this. And if you can actually get into break mode, you've got the yellow current statement indicator. You do not have any syntax errors in this procedure because this means you have compiled it and you have it started running. Okay, so far so good. I'm just going to go one step at a time. So here's a little tool that we have under debug. We have here step into. Step into, step over. They both do the same thing. The step over here is just in case your step into breaks, your step over will do. Actually, it does something different if you call a sub-procedure. We'll talk about that a little bit later today. But both of these they're just going to execute the current statement and move on. So let's F8 or Shift F8. And just go ahead and hit F8. F8. You come in here, F8. Executes that line, takes me to the next one. executes that line, takes me to the next one, and now I'm going to try to execute this line, and I get a runtime error. Okay, there's a question here. Yeah, so the question is, does F8 work for subs and for functions, or sub procedures and function procedures? The answer is yes. Now, I say yes, but hold on for just a second. We'll come back to this in just a second. So I think the reason that you're thinking that is that you've noticed that if you're right here and you press F8, this will actually launch your code running step at a time by pressing F8. Well, that's kind of neat. And that will not work if there's an argument here. So if I'm saying, y as a string, So now if I try to hit F8 on this, I got an error there. That's a problem. F8. It won't start running this. It's not because, and this is what you ran into when you're working with a function. It's not because it's a function. It's because it's got a parameter. And so it's just like with F5. If you've got a parameter to run it with F5, you can't, because you've got to have a value for this parameter. So that's why F8 won't work here. And almost always functions take arguments. They take parameters, and so that's why it's not working for you. But if you get a breakpoint set in your code, and then you call the function through whatever means you call it by, once you hit that breakpoint, then F8 will take you one step at a time. Okay, other questions? I forgot what I was saying. Oh, yeah, it was this fact that we have an error here. So let me go ahead and run this, and F8 to go until we hit the error. Okay, so now we get a runtime error. It says on it, runtime error. That means the error didn't happen at compile time, a compile error. That's when, hey, we're trying to figure out what we're going to do. That's compile time. Once it's figured out what we're going to try to do, and then it goes and starts doing it, that's runtime. And so this is an error that happens. Compile time is now passed. We're totally compiled, and now we're trying to run it. This error means all of my code looks beautiful. The interpreter looks at this and it says, this is perfect. Look, dim x, that's a valid variable name, a valid token. As integer, that's a valid data type. I know what to do with that. X equals 11, an assignment statement, wonderful. If x is greater than 10, oh great, we're doing an inequality comparison. Oh, and it's conditional branching, wonderful. There's an end if right where it belongs. Debug.print is worksheets. We're looking for something called, something, I don't know what it's called, but it's in quotes. That's just some string name, that's great. We're going to say name. It understands everything I'm trying to do here, but what's the problem? What's the error? Yeah, there's no sheet named product. Syntactically, it's beautiful. Valid collection, worksheets, open parenthesis, open quote, string, close quote, close parenthesis, dot, valid property. It's printing this. It says this is perfect. All the syntax is exactly right. Right, a syntax error, I forgot the quote. I forgot the period, I forgot the parenthesis, but everything it understands. But when it tries to execute it, it can't do it. So that's why it's called a runtime error. Now, all of your logic errors, you got to get rid of them. All of your syntax errors, you got to get rid of them. All of your runtime errors, you don't have to get rid of them. Instead, it'd be nice, get rid of them, you could. But the other option is you can trap them. You can say, listen, let the error happen, and then let me just decide what to do if the error happens. So you got to think about this, is that the interpreter, the VBA interpreter, I think I told you this before, right? It's the saddest interpreter out of all the interpreters in all the programming clubs in the world. The VBA interpreter is sad. Why is the VBA interpreter so sad? Yeah, no one uses it. And 99.9% of people have Excel. They don't even know it's there. And so it's just longing to run code. And now you've given it some code to run. It just wants to run code. And so, but it's kind of like what's the word? Like a prima donna. It will run all this code exactly the way you want it to. But you get to a line like this that doesn't execute. And what does the interpreter say? Oh, I can't work under these conditions. And just stops. There could be hundreds of lines of code afterwards that it would just be ready to run. But because it got to one line that it couldn't actually make happen, it just stops. And so fortunately, we have, this is what a runtime error is. So fortunately, we have the opportunity to say, no, listen. All right, listen, if you bump into a line that you can't execute for whatever reason, I'll just give you something else to do. The interpreter says, great. As long as I got something to do, I'm happy. So here's how we do it. I'm gonna show you a common kind of error trap. It's not, I don't favor this particular syntax in VBA, but let me show it to you because you will see it. And you may even find a good use for it. Here's how we go. We say on error. This happens before the line that we think is suspect to cause a runtime error. On error, we're saying, hey, listen, if there's an error from this time until I give you further directions, further instructions, if there's an error, we'll tell it what to do. Go to, and then we give it some label. I'll call it ERR-HANDLR. ERR-HANDLR. So this is a label. And we're saying, all right, if you get an error, stop what you're doing here, and I'll give you somewhere else you can go that has plenty of good code for you to execute. Now, I have to actually, this is a label. I have to create the label that tells it where to jump to. It has to be inside this subprocedure. It can't be some other subprocedure. It's got to be inside this subprocedure. I'll come down here just before end sub, and I'll put that label again, ERR-HANDLR. And I'll put a colon after it. That now becomes a mark, a label in my code that I can jump to when I've had this error. And what are we going to say? I don't know, maybe a message box. Message box, there was an error. There was an error. Okay, so now I'm going to run the same code again, but I've got now this error handler and this error trap in here. So let me go ahead and run that. Do I have a runtime error? No, I have a message box. I've converted that runtime error into a regular message box. This is not going to stop the code. There's not any debug, go debug the code or end the code. This is just, as far as the interpreter is concerned, this is normal stuff. In fact, there was an error. Let me just go ahead and put a different, I'll put the there was an error into the title bar, and in here I'm going to put ERR.description. So it turns out there is an object called ERR. And there has two properties that are really, really handy. One is called the number, and one is called the description. When you get an error, what did it say? Error, runtime error number 9, subscript out of range. Is that what it said before? Let me just take off the error handler part here for a moment. I forgot what the error said. Yeah, runtime error 9, subscript out of range. Delightful. This is the ERR number, and this is the ERR description. So you have access to it programmatically, even though you haven't interrupted your code. So you can say, listen, if there's an error, just go somewhere else to execute some code that doesn't have an error, and then you could look at it here and you can say, hey, listen, if it's error number 9, let's do something. So we have access to this ERR object. Now this is just going to display the message, that same error message, subscript out of range. So let me run this. So there it is, subscript out of range. Why is it called subscript out of range, by the way? Let me just give you the history there. Let's suppose that what I was after here is I wanted to see a particular sheet number 3. That is the subscript. In fact, if we could write it as a subscript, we would. What is a subscript? What does it mean? What's a subscript, by the way? Not in VBA lingo, just in English. What's a subscript? Anyone know what a subscript is? Yeah, it's like something that's it's text that's a little bit smaller and it's shifted down on the line. It's like the opposite of a footnote. Like the footnote reference, a superscript is when it's a little bit higher. A subscript is it's a little bit lower. If we could write this as a subscript, that's what we would do. Here's the collection of worksheets. Which one do you want? Want number 3. And if I could make that 3 a little bit smaller and put it as a subscript, I would do that. But in a text editor, there's no font differences. I can't make that smaller. And so instead, what we say, the way that we show the subscript is we put it in parentheses here. And so that really is a subscript, but we can't make it look like a subscript, and so but it's still called a subscript. And so I should get that same error if I run this, subscript out of range. What's the valid range for my subscripts for referring to a worksheets in this workbook right now? What's the range? Yeah, well, 1 to 2. That's the range. I tried to give it a subscript that was out of range. That's where the error comes from. I'm trying to refer to a sheet that doesn't exist by subscript. Now, it's a little bit strange that when I put the name of the when I put the sheet name instead of a subscript, that I still get the same error message, but that's because it's really the same problem. I'm trying to refer to a worksheet that doesn't exist. Technically, it's not a subscript, but they figure that's close enough. That's really what they think with the error message. And the problem is, when you're just beginning in this program, is that so often the folks that wrote these error messages went, you know what, that's close enough. And so a lot of times the message isn't that helpful, as is the case here. Okay. So that is one, but let's do this. Let me go ahead and make this products. So now, would this give me a runtime error? Is there any problem with this code now, runtime or compile time? No, it's just fine. Well, watch what happens. I'm going to run it now. And there was an error. What was the error? Nothing. Wonderful. What happened here? What happened? I'm running along here. X is greater than 10. Great. I'm going to do this. If I have an error, go down to error handler. Print this thing. It printed just fine. In fact, we'll go to G here. Printed the name of it just fine up there. Oh, Control G doesn't turn it off. I would have thought it toggled it. We got to the end if. We got here error handler. That's a label. And we bumped into this code. We got here anyway. It's not like that label does something to say this is the end of the sub procedure. It's just a mark in the code that you could jump to. And so I'm going to come here and say exit sub. So now what we're saying, if I make it all the way to this point here, I'm done. The only reason I get past this is if I jumped past it, and all the rest of the code down here now is error handling code. And it could be more complex. I could have, if error.number equals 9, do if error.number equals 5, else do this. So we could have some real logic in here. Go ahead. Oh, could I say on error? I have never tried that. Maybe you read the book and he said you can do this. I don't know. Exit sub. No, you can't do that. Was that the question? Or could you have multiple things down here? Or up above. So no. You get one thing. There's some different things you can do here, but you get one directive here. Yeah. If you want to do multiple lines, tell it to go somewhere else and have multiple lines there. Okay, let's leave this example aside. This is not my preferred way to do error handling in VBA, but I wanted you to see it because it's really common. I will show you my preferred way, which I think is much better. That's why it's my preferred way. Okay, so now here's a context. We're going to want to, have some kind of procedure where I can tell it, listen, I want the data that begins in C1. And I want to make a list out of that data on some new sheet. Maybe I've got a sheet called lists, and that's where I want to put it. And I want to be able to say, listen, I want a list of categories, a list of departments, a list of manufacturers. I want to take that data, collapse it down just to unique values, maybe sort it, and put it on my list sheet so I have access to it there from wherever else I might want to access the code. So that's the goal here. So I'm going to make a sub. I'm going to call it make list. I'm going to expect to receive, why don't we call this the start cell? As a range. And because this sub-procedure now requires an argument to be sent to it, I can't just run it, so I'm going to make myself a little helper function here to help me run this. Make my Acme sub runner. Whoops. Acme sub runner. And this is just going to call make list and passing it the arguments that it needs. I'm going to do this workbook, worksheets. Which worksheet do I want? Products, dot range, B1. Whew. Okay, so now I'm kind of set up to work. Because I've got an argument, because I've got a parameter here, I can't just run this one, but this one doesn't have an argument, and it's just going to call make list and pass it what it needs to get down to business. And so what I would like to do, I'm going to start off by activating my lists sheet. So I'm expecting that I've got, maybe what I'll do is I will bind, let me declare a sheet variable. Maybe I'll call this L. No, I'll call it S as a worksheet. And now I'm going to set S equal to this workbook, worksheets, and I'm looking for my lists worksheet. Right? And we've seen this line before, quite often, where we're just trying to make our code a little bit more workable. Instead of having to say this workbook, worksheets, list, I'm just going to bind a worksheet variable onto that. So now, henceforth, for the rest of the sub-procedure, I can now say s.range, and I'm referring to the right worksheet without having to have all of the overhead to get there. But what is the problem with this code? I'm going to run it. There's a problem. Here we go. Run. Runtime error number 9, subscript out of range, debug, right here, subscript out of range. There is no worksheet lists. Listen, if I call the make list worksheet and there's no worksheet, there's not even a worksheet called list, what should my code do? It shouldn't die. Just create the sheet. We need a sheet called list, and if there's nothing there, let's make it. So that's what we're going to do. Now, there's another approach that we could take here. We could say, no. Before you try to bind onto it, let's make sure it's there. We could make a loop, a for each loop, that loops through every worksheet in the workbook and checks to see if there's one called lists. And if there's not, then create it. That's not such a bad idea. It's a lot of work. And, more importantly, the truth is, how long would it take to loop through? We could have like hundreds of worksheets here. How long would it take to loop through all the worksheets to find out there's one called lists? Millisecond. It wouldn't even be noticeable. But there are some things where you say, wow, for me to find out if I'm going to have an error, it's expensive. It takes a noticeable amount of time for me to find out if there's going to be an error. And so one option here is let's find out there's going to be an error, and if there would be an error, don't execute the line that would have an error. Instead, make the sheet and move on. But here we'll say, listen, if it's expensive to find out there's an error, just try it and trap for the code. It could be way faster to try it and let it fail and find out that it failed and move on than to go through some long process to find out if it would fail. And so it's not just because we're lazy to write the loop. It wouldn't be too hard to write the loop. It's just a different technique to approach this. And kind of there are valid reasons why you would want to do this. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set up an error trap. This error trap's going to be a little bit different. Instead of, if there's an error, go down here and, when you say if there's an error, go down here and do something, here's where that's really useful for. This is an error I can't recover from. Send me an email. I could have code down there that sends an email to me, or text message. Send me a text message. My program had an error I wasn't expecting to have. That'd be great to know. Send me some information about kind of where it happened and so forth. But here, I want to see that there was an error. I want to then actually adapt to it and move on with my code. So here's how we do it. On error. Instead of go to some label, I'm going to say resume next. On error, resume next. What's that? Yeah, so what on error, resume next does is it says if you, from here on until I give you further instructions, if you get to a line that causes an error, it must not have been important anyway, skip it and keep right on going. Now, you could just think, hey, let me put on error, resume next at the top of each of my sub-procedures. Never have a runtime error. True, but what have you done? You've converted all of your runtime errors, which are really easy to find, into logic errors, which are really hard to find. So don't do that. You don't want to have broad swaths of your code operating under an on error, resume next. So instead, we're going to say, listen, here's a line that's suspect. This could fail because the list sheet might not exist. And so I'm going to put a little error trap right around here. Now, let me do this. This is the one line that I'm worried about. And so after this line, I'm going to say, now on error, continue with your normal error handling techniques. That's not how you say that. But that's the point I want to get to the interpreter. At this point, if I have an error, go back to normal. Go to your normal error handling behavior. Normal error behavior. Boop. Normal error behavior. That's actually a comment for what we're going to do. The syntax is really weird. Okay. So in here, here's how I say it. On error, go to 0. If there's ever a time to apologize for VBA, this is it. Maybe also on the whole parentheses things about when you put parentheses, but this is the other place. That's a really weird thing to say. Let me tell you where it comes from. Back in the 70s, when basic language was brand new, it was a terrible time. And it was bad hair, the music was bad, we had bell bottoms, and when we wrote in BASIC, we had to put line numbers, which means you start off to write a line number 1, you put a 1, and then you write your line. My next line number 2, you have to write the line number. Line number 3, you write the line number, you write the line. And so every number had to be every line had to be numbered. What would happen if you got between lines 5 and 6, you thought, I want to put another line in here. You got to renumber all the lines after that. You go through, okay, 6 is now 7, 7 is now 8, 8 is now 9. What if you have 1,000 lines? What made it worse is that we use this go to statement here to jump to different parts of the code. Go to that line number, go to this line number, go to this line number. So not only would you have to renumber your lines, you'd have to renumber all the references that went to those other parts of the lines. It was terrible. They had whole programs just for renumbering your code. I got to renumber this code, run this program on my code to renumber it. We don't have line numbers anymore in BASIC. But this notion, in fact, then back on those days, what do you suppose was the very first, the smallest legal line number? I'll tell you what, -5, not a valid line number. What do you think the smallest valid line number is? It's not 0, it's 1. The smallest line number you can make was line number 1. There's no line number 0. And so when I'm telling it on error go to 0, I am telling it to do something impossible. There is no line 0. And so the interpreter just goes, I can't do that. I guess I'll go back to my normal error behavior, which is when I have an error, stop the code, put a dialog box up to the user and say, this is error number 9, subscript out of range. What do you want to do? You got some choices. Help, which is no help at all. You've got end the program. You've got debug. There's some other, I don't remember what it is, but you've got a few choices here. That's the normal behavior. And that is how you tell it, resume your normal error behavior, resume your normal error handling behavior. It's a really weird thing to say, but that's how you have to do it. Okay, so now we've isolated our error trap just to the suspect line, but now we've got to do something with it. So now let's come right here and we're going to say, we want to now check to see, did you have an error? So I'm going to do this. If error.number is equal to 0, then I'll do something. Else if error.number is equal to, what was the error number that we had for subscript out of range? Is equal to 9, then I'll do something. And it could be that there are, kind of lots of different things that I'm anticipating. In this case, it's just that one, and so I'll have an else, I'll do something else, and an end if. I could do this just as well with a select case statement, but I've already written this, so we'll be okay. What does it mean if the error number is 0? Error number 9 is subscript out of range. What's error number 0? No 0 at all. This is not the error you're looking for. That's the condition when there's no active error. And so this would mean there was no error. Everything is great. Now, how about error number 9? This is subscript out of range. Now, we know something about this because we have narrowed this error trap down to this line right here. If we get subscript out of range from this line, what does it mean? It means there is no sheet called lists. Let's make one. So I'm just going to fix the problem. I'm going to say set s equal to this workbook dot worksheets dot add. Make a new worksheet and bind my s variable onto it. One more thing, s.name equals what? Lists. So the problem that I have here is because the worksheet didn't exist. So great, make the worksheet exist, give it the name I'm expecting it to, and now by the time I get to the end of my code block here, now S is bound on to a worksheet named lists, either because it was there before or because I just created it and bound it onto it. So we see that? What do I do on the else here? I am never expecting to hit this. So I'm going to put stop. What's stop? Stop is, it's actually, if you put in here end, that like terminates the whole code, just stops the code. Well, it ends the code. Stop takes you into break mode. And so I really am never expecting to get to that else. But if I do, for some strange reason, if I do get there, I'd kind of like to see where the error happened. And so this will take me here, and I'm not sure I would leave this in something that I'm going to hand off to someone else. I might put something else here that sends me a text message. It says, you know, we didn't expect this to happen, but you're right here in this particular procedure, and this is the logged in person who's just done something that caused an error you didn't expect. You can do stuff like that. But here I'm just going to say, I want to see, if I get here, I want to see it because I'm never expecting to get here. What do I need to do if there's no error at this point? Well, nothing. Sometimes there is. Sometimes say, oh, there's no error, then do this. In this case, I don't need to do anything if there's no error. I'm just trying to make sure that S is bound onto that sheet. Perfect. So it seems a little bit strange to have this here, even though I have no code running, but that's going to spend my else if block. If it's error number 0, I'm not going to do anything else in this block. And so we leave it like that. So now I'm feeling pretty good about this. Let me just go ahead and put a debug.print s.name here. I'll stop this and I will run it. No error. Oh, you know, I should have stepped through that. Let me get my immediate window open. Let me go delete the sheet that just got created. And I'm going to step through this. So I am going to put a breakpoint on my dim statement. I'm going to click on that until I can put a breakpoint on it. And it turns out you're not allowed to put breakpoints on dim statements because dim statements are not executable code. Your dim statement, the interpreter says, all right, look through all the dim statements we got in here. And when we start to run this, before we run any of this code, allocate that memory. So the dim statements don't execute like other statements do. It's just telling us how much memory. That all gets allocated, and then I've got something besides a dim will be my first executable code. That's why you cannot put a breakpoint on a dim statement. Because it's not like you say, okay, I've done these 3 things and now I'm on the dim statement, because the dim statements all get processed before the code starts to run. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and run this. And I've gotten rid of my list sheet, so I'm back the way that I started. And I'm going to step through this just by pressing F8. So this should be an error because I'm trying to bind that S variable onto a sheet that doesn't exist. So, but it didn't take me anywhere because I've got the error trap. On error resume next says, hey, just keep on moving when you have an error. Now, I've got an error. I should be able to take a peek up here at ERR number. Yeah, error number 9. So is error number 0? No. So we'll move on to the next clause. Is error number 9? Yes. So we come into here. I make a new worksheet. I should be able to see the new worksheet. There it is, called sheet 2. I'm now going to rename that new sheet to lists. There it is. And we'll print the name of that worksheet. Beautiful. That was great. Let's run it again and see the path we go through this time. So I'll run this. All right, let's see what error number is now. Error number is, this time through error number is 0. Why? It's because there's no error, but why was there an error last time but not this time? Yeah, the worksheet's there. I mean, the last time through the code, I created the worksheet, so we're going through a different path this time. And so now we actually got into if error number equals 0, but there was nothing for us to stop on there. And so we stop at the end of the if statement. we run through, and we'll print that lists again. Okay. And so that is the notion of what they call a local error trap. So here's the suspect line. Here's the line that I think could be a problem. I'll write a trap all around this. Does this seem a little bit strange to you? I've got one line, and the code to protect that line is like a dozen lines. Yeah, that's the way error traps are. Well, not quite a dozen, but it's a few lines. Questions on this approach to doing an error trap? Tell me how you're feeling in terms of comfort level with error trap. How many of you are saying, just show up, you can show a hand, show up a hand. 5 if you're going, I totally get this. 1 or even 0 if you think this is like witchcraft. How does this even work? Go ahead and everyone put a hand up. Kind of tell me where you're feeling. I'm seeing a few zeros here, a 2, some 2s, a lot of 2s, a 3. Okay, you don't want to be you don't want to go along with your buddies there with all the 2s, but a 3. Okay, so let's do another example. In fact, our next example here is going to be part of the same process. So now we have gotten attached onto the sheet that we're going to manipulate. Either it was there already and now we're bound onto it, or we created it and now we're bound onto it. But now we know we've got, S is bound onto that sheet. Wonderful. There's a question in the back. Go ahead. Oh, okay, so here's the question. The question is, what is this? Are you supposed to figure out this could cause an error and do it ahead of time? Or do you kind of wait until there is an error and then decide, I better put some error handling on that? If you're writing this for your own use, this is code that you're using, probably the second. Wait until you have an error and then, code around it. If you're writing this in such a way that you're going to put it into the hands of Edna in accounting, you're going to anticipate it. So you're going to say, this could be an error, and we're going to have to code around that so that we make it work. So yeah, it just kind of depends on who's the target audience. Okay, yeah, we took one line and we just made it that big. That's great. Wonderful. Okay, so now at this point, let me just put a note here. What do we know? We know that we have a reference to the list worksheet. Okay, so now our next goal here is that ultimately what this is going to look like is it's going to say here like category. And then it's going to have a bunch of categories under it. It's going to say manufacturer. And I'll have a bunch of manufacturers under it. It's going to have, what else is there? What's the other one that's kind of department? It'll have one that says department. Okay. So let's say that it looks like this. We've got these two lists, and there's actually lists, actually under them. And now let's say we're trying to add the list for departments. We're saying build the list of departments. Look at all of our data here and give me just the unique list of departments. That's what we want to do. So what should happen? Just tell me in English, what should happen when I say build the department list? What should happen here? Where should that department list go? You understand what I'm asking when I say we're going to make a list of departments? Yeah. So what our code needs to do is it has to figure out, D1 is where we're going to be working here today because it's the first empty cell. A1 is going to be empty for a reason you'll see here in a moment. But yeah, so we're going to want to come in here and we're going to want to put in, what's it called? Department. And then, then we're going to want to put in the unique list of departments right here. Now let's suppose we've done that and we run the code again, build my list of departments. Now what do we want to do? Do we want to make another column that says departments and puts the list of departments there? We probably want to update the list of departments. So maybe we've added some departments in our data. We want to refresh it. We want to replace that current department list. So that's kind of our chore. We're going to decide that now. Again, we could decide this in such a way that we don't ever have the error happen, but because we're learning about trapping for errors, we're going to do it in a way that we'll let the error happen, see that we had an error, and then handle it. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give myself a variable up here. I need to know which column we're going to work in. So let me dim call as an integer. And now after so I've just created an integer variable call. And so now after I know I'm bound onto my proper worksheet, I'm now ready to see if I can find in row 1, I want to find the name that we're after. Oh, I'm not sure we've ever done code to find. So let me record this. It's really simple to write. Don't record it along with me. Just watch. I'm going to record a macro. We'll call it macro 1. That's great. And I'm just going to highlight this row. I'm going to do Control F, and I'm going to search for department. Department. Find next. Oh, look, it found it. Close. Stop. I'm done. Last class, I forgot to hit stop. I recorded the whole rest of the lecture. It was thrilling. Okay, so I'm going to look at module 2. And here's my find code. Now, this looks a lot worse than it's going to be. You don't have to type all this. But let's get started with it. And let's just take a look at it. So I selected the whole first row. And then I said, with the selection, we're going to find something. So instead, let me just copy this part, and we're going to reduce this dramatically. But I'm just going to try to find in row number 1 on my lists worksheet, my S worksheet. So I'm going to say S dot rows 1, first one. I'm not selecting it and then working with a selection. I'm just referring to row number 1. And from there, I'm going to say dot find. Now, you'll remember that when we have arguments that we're sending over to some method, in this case, or a sub or a function, there's 2 ways to do it. You can give them just in their order, or you can give them named. In this case, they're named, but the names happen to be in the order that they occur anyway. And so I'm just going to simplify this by saying, all right, what are we finding? Department. We'll leave that hard-coded for now. We'll adjust it. After active cell, I don't care about that. Let that be the default. Look in, so leave the comma. Look in, I don't care about that. Let that be the default. Look at, I care about. Look at can either be XL part, meaning it's anywhere in the cell, or XL whole, meaning it's the whole cell. That's what I want. And the rest of these I don't care about. And I don't need the equal sign there. Okay. So now I'm looking for department in the first row of my list worksheet, and it's got to be match the whole cell contents. And now I don't really want to activate it. I just want to know what column that is. And so now let's just say that my column variable equals the column where we found it. That's pretty good. I'm just going to put a breakpoint in code here, stop. I'm going to run this code to this point. So now column should be where it found department. So let's look for column. Sure enough, it found it on the 4th column. That's wonderful. And is that right? Yeah, column D, number 4, we found it. But what if it's not there? Let me go ahead and just delete all of these. Delete. All right, so now let's see what happens if I run that. Oh, I didn't even make it to my breakpoint because I've got runtime error 91, object variable or block or with block variable not set. Can someone tell me why the error happens? And then maybe someone else can tell me some intuition for why it says what it says. I'm saying here, I've got an integer variable here. I'm trying to set it equal to whatever column it says department. Which column does it say department in? I got rid of them. None of them. So now it's going to say S. Does it know what S is? Yeah, it's a worksheet. row number 1 on S. Does it know what I'm talking about there? Yeah. Find department, looking at, a whole text match. Is it going to know what this is talking about? Does this refer to a particular object? Just the part I have highlighted. Yeah, that's a row on the sheet. That row is an object. Does this refer to a particular object? No, because the find fails. There is no column that has that value. So when we're looking for it, it can't find it. But I'm assuming that we did find it because I'm saying, hey, just give me the column property of that range that you found. What did it find? Nothing. It literally found nothing. That's what it's called in VBA. When you try to bind onto an object that doesn't exist, it actually binds onto an object called nothing. So it found nothing, which is kind of weird, but in a strange way. It really did find nothing, but it's bound onto an object called nothing. So, but nothing does not have a column property. And so this part fails. You're trying to refer to a property on no object. And so the error, object variable not set, it's saying, listen, you tried to call a property of this object expression here. Now, again, it's not really an object variable, it's an object expression. But the guys who are writing the error message are like, you know what, that's close enough. And so it says this is not referring to any object, and so it fails when you try to call the column property. And so what I'd like to do here is I'd like to notice when that happens. What does it mean if I get error number 91 here? It didn't find that name. Oh, in fact, remember we are passing in a reference to a cell. So we've got a start cell here. So instead of looking for department, we're going to just look for start cell's value. That way this will generalize it for whatever list we're trying to make. All right, let's build the error trap. So I'm going to put two things straight away. I'm going to put two things. I'm going to put the beginning of my error trap that says if there's an error, move on. And then I'll put the end of the error trap that says, hey, if there's an error after now, I'm not anticipating it, do your normal thing. So how do I say if there's an error, move on? On error, what is it? Resume next. All right, now how do I say if there's an error, resume your normal error handling behavior? On error, go to 0. Oh, it's even up there on the screen with even a good comment. Okay. So now let's do the trapping. If, how do I check for what error has happened? ERR, the error object, dot number. If the number equals 0, we'll do something. That means there's no error at all. Now the error we're anticipating, else if ERR.number equals 91. Oh, no space between the else and the if. Else and if. What am I going to put inside the else? Just stop. Some error happened when I tried to bind onto that column, but it wasn't the one I was expecting. This means need to make a new column. Okay. I don't think we have to do anything if it's error number 0, so we'll leave that one blank. Because we'll know the column. That's what we need to know. We need to know the column that we're going to be manipulating on our list sheet. Okay, so what do we do here now? Let's say we do have in here our, we're looking for department. We've got category. We've got manufacturer. And now, in this case, we're going to want to put our, what's another one called? Department. We're going to want to put the department here in column D. Well, how do we find column D? I mean, it's not always going to be column D, right? It's going to be the first column that's empty after column A. How do we find it? Any thoughts? I think we talked about this once before, but it's a powerful enough thing we're going to see it again. Anyone remember? If you were trying to find, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, let's start all the way at the right hand and come back until we bump into some data. And so, let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to say column equals s.cells. which row do I want? Row number 1. Which column do I want? I want to know, I want them all, however many there are. Columns.count. Oops, I got to put a question mark in there. There's 16,384. And it's, it would be reasonable to put in here 16,384, or instead just put columns.count. That refers to the very last column on that first row, the very last cell on that first row. It's all the way over there at the right. And from there, we want to say dot end, come back to the left, XL2 left. And from there, we want to know the column. We don't want to activate it. We're not trying to select it or get the value that's there. We just want to know the column where that happens. Now, from what you know about like control left arrow, is it going to be on the data, the last data, or just before the last data? It's going to be on the last data. And if we pick that up as the column, we're going to have to write over something. We don't want to do that. So let's just +1, which is why A is going to end up blank, because if there's nothing there, we're going to shift over until we hit A. We're going to +1. That's okay. This is going to have a blank column in A. That's okay with me. So now we either have gotten the column by finding where the label is, or we didn't find it. What we're going to do is we're just going to get the next available column. And we did that then with the error trap. Again, here we're never expecting to get to this, so we'll put the else clause in there just in case, and that'll let us figure out what error has happened at this point. So now I think we're ready to do the work to build the list. The good news is building the list is a breeze. I can never remember how to do it though, so I'm going to record myself again. I'm going to come to my products list, and this is one you'll be able to type easily as well. Macro 2, that's great. I'm just going to copy this department here, and ultimately what we're going to do, I could have got the pasting done before. I'm going to come here, I'm going to paste. That we could do by hand, and we will. But now I'm going to come to data, text columns, no, remove duplicates, expand the selection, no, continue with the current selection. All right, got rid of 856 values and kept 4. Wonderful. All right, let me stop my code. And let's go take a look at what recorded. So we've got the copy, and then we'll do the copy, but what I'm really after here is just remove duplicates. And of course, it's hard-coded this range here, but we'll pick that up here as well. So I'm just going to copy this code. And that's what we're trying to do. I'm going to drop it in here in module 1. But I got to do the copy first. So let's do the copy. So here's what I want to say. Remember, I'm passing in a reference to a cell. I just want to copy that whole column that has that cell in it. So I'm going to say start cell dot entire column dot copy. Now, whenever you record yourself copying, it's always a copy, and then you select something else, and then you paste. But the copy method itself takes an argument called the destination. You can just push it straight over to the destination, which is nice. And so the destination is going to be my list worksheet, which is S, and I'm going to put it in columns, number, cell, number, call, that is. The whole point, I was trying to figure out what my call variable was going to be so I can know where to put the data. And now I either found that call variable by finding where the label already was, or I've got a new column to work with. Either way, I'm ready to paste that in there. And this same column that I just referred to is going to be what I want to remove the duplicates out of. Columns, just one column, header, yes, that looks great. So now when I run this, that should bring that data in. Wow, no errors. Kind of surprising. And it brought in, I brought in category. So it found category and brought that in. Let me go ahead and bring in manufacturer. I spell that right? I'm just going to make a different call up here. Instead of calling B1, I'm going to call C1. I'm not sure if that's manufacturer or not. That was department, so manufacturer must be the next one over. E1. I'll run that one. And now that's brought in my manufacturer. And in each case, it's limited these just to the unique values. Delightful. So we have that example actually working. And we've done 2 error traps. We could have done it without using either error traps, right? We could have anticipated the possibility of an error and worked around it. But today is understanding this idea of trapping for an error and then looking at what error is happening and deciding what to do based on that error. Questions on the error trap? Okay, we've done another example. And I realized it was pretty much like the first example, so hold your fingers up again. Are you still at 2? Have you gone up a little bit? Are you at 5? Got a 4, 5, feeling pretty good about it. Oh, some of those 2s are a little higher. Okay. Good news, you have one more shot at this, and that's the homework that's due tonight, which tries to delete a worksheet. Right? And of course, if you try to delete that worksheet and it doesn't exist, that's going to cause an error, which is kind of strange because the very thing you're trying to make happen is what causes the error. You're trying to make that sheet not exist. And it already doesn't exist, that's the problem. So this should get you down that road if you haven't already gone there. Okay, well, last thing then before we go is, so we've seen the error trap. We haven't seen a whole lot in terms of the error of the debugging tools. What have we seen? We've seen stop, where you can write a breakpoint into code. I'm going to take this one out because I don't need it here anymore. We saw the breakpoint that you could set here on the line. Once you have a breakpoint, you can then step. Now let's look at the difference between step into and step over. Let me put a breakpoint here on make list, and I'll run this one. So we hit this breakpoint. Now this is a call to another sub-procedure. Here's where step into, step over, step out become really important. Because if I step into this, it's actually going to go and go through this one line at a time. It's going to step through this procedure. I might say, you know what? The problem I'm trying to locate, it's not down there. It's up here. I don't want to go through that one at a time. That's what step over does. Now, it's tempting to think step over means skip this line. Like if you were stepping over something, right? You wouldn't actually step in it. You'd step over it. But that's not what happens. When you say step over, it actually just execute the whole procedure without stepping through it. So there's no thing that says, oh, this line that's highlighted right here, skip it and move on. And you could drag the statement past it. But let's see what happens if I step over. So debug step over. It ran that whole thing as if it was one statement, and it brought me back here. So it's done that now. It's kind of bad because I already had that running. It was manufacturer. So let's just delete some of that so we can see that it works. I'll just drag this current statement back up there, run it again. The step over, debug step over, and we'll see that brought back in the manufacturer. And now let's run it again, but this time let's step into. So debug step into, and I'll just continue to step into here with F8. We can now see we're going through one line at a time. Now, I have now stepped into this sub-procedure. I might decide, oh, I didn't mean to come in here. I don't want to be stepping down into here. Get me out of here. Finish running all the rest of this code and take me back to where the call came from. That's step out. So debug step out just says finish this sub-procedure and go back to where it was called from. Here's the next line after it was called. So that's step into, step over, step out. Questions? A couple more tools for debugging. One, you have seen a lot. That's the immediate window. This is my favorite debugging tool. I just, once I'm in break mode, I want to see what variables do I have. Just come and print them out right here. But there's another handy one called the locals window. And what the locals window does, oh, it's too big. Go down, locals window. I'll get it to float here. Float, you locals window. There we go. So let me come back here and step into my other sub-procedure here. Step into F8. Okay, so now the locals window just shows you all your variables. Now that I'm inside this sub-procedure, all the variables used here have been allocated in memory. They have values. So S is nothing. It's bound onto the nothing object. Column is 0. But as I step through this, we'll see that change. So I'll just step through this with F8. And as soon as we bind on, I'm about to bind S on, watch this right here, watch the nothing. We're going to see that S now gets bound onto something else. So now it's bound onto a worksheet. I'll keep moving, F8. We'll get to the column, and we'll see that column pick up its value. I'm going to execute that line, and that value changes immediately. So all of your variables, you can just see what they currently. You don't have to print them out in the immediate window. You just see what they are. They're all right there. And so that's pretty good. That's the locals window. Okay, the final one is called the watch window. What a watch is it's nice to be able to see what your variables are, but you might want to see something that is more, an expression that's more complex. Here's one right here. Error number equals 0. That is either true or false at any time. Right? If the error number is 0, it's true. As soon as we get an error, it's false. I just want to see the results of that expression. Well, I do that with a watch. So I'll right-click this and choose Add Watch. Then gives my expression right there, and I'll say OK. So now I'm going to have as many watches as I want. You can put watches on complex expressions or simple ones. It could just be watching a value of a variable. So right now that's true. And if anything happened to change that, we would see that change to false. So the locals window shows all your variables. But you can say, I want something more complex than variables. That's what your watch window is for. Final thing is that you can do a crazy thing called a conditional breakpoint. Let me just go ahead and edit this watch expression. And instead of it being a watch expression, I can say, take me to break mode when this expression is true, or when it changes. And then the interpreter now is watching every time we change something. Did that change this watch expression? Did it make it true? And if it's set to break when it's true, it would actually say, take you into breakpoint, take you into break mode. You don't have a breakpoint set, you don't have stop, but as soon as that expression becomes true, stop on the next line of executable code. As soon as it changes, you've got something you don't know why it's changing and going out of bounds, you can put a conditional breakpoint on it, and as soon as it changes, boom, you can see the line of code that changed it. It can be great when you've got lots and lots and lots of code, you're not quite sure when things are going wrong to help you track down the problem. Oh, we made it. Debugging and error handling. Any questions? Thanks for coming. I will see you tomorrow. Class dismissed. You're not allowed to have questions. You don't even have a computer. You do have a computer.
So when she opened up her instructions, it messed up her whole Microsoft Office.
So now I can't open anything like OneNote or my publisher or anything.
So you're doing one of my homework assignments?
Yeah.
The one due tonight.
Excel will need to be closed as a result.
So I've tried the repair thing a couple times and it doesn't do anything.
Reinstall Office.
Okay.
Okay. That's what he just wanted to know.
If that doesn't work, you get an extension
Okay.
on your homework. So
One real question, quick question
curious.
though.
Yeah.
She has a license. This is her dad's old computer.
uh-huh.
So my only concern with downloading Office through BYU is it's going to take off her old.
You get 5 installations. So you can install it here, you can install it on your other computer, you can install it on your Aunt Sylvia's computer. Your license is for 5 installations.
The thing is that once she's not a student anymore, isn't it gone?
Well, it'll live until every so often it says you got to prove you're a student again, log back in. At which point, if you can't provide your credentials, it'll say you got to buy it.
That's the only concern.
Oh, you're saying, yeah, because
right now
he.
she has her dad's.
That's right, and that will never expire.
Yeah. And so I was about to install it, but then I thought, well, that'll delete that. Once she graduates, she's not going to have Office
Which is
anymore.
why I never downloaded it in the first place.
Because you have to take off the old one to get the new one.
So
I would just feel bad. Are you graduating soon?
Yeah, in April.
So you may use this laptop in the future. It has something to do with the license.
Yeah.
Because that's what it said for your non-commercial use. Did it ever finish? Because I clicked on the update. Still checking for updates. I clicked on that at the beginning of class.
Yeah, that might be because it's got, I don't think they would be connected, but
So it just says we're going to have to remove the 2013 if we want to do the BYU Office Microsoft Office.
oh, so you were starting to do this?
I was starting to do it and then I realized.
Yeah, good
if I
thinking.
take it off-
Cancel this. Next is like Google. How do I reinstall Office 2013? And
Since you're getting stuck on this for the homework tonight, like don't worry about it. We'll make sure that when you do complete it, that you won't get penalized for the time. But if you can tonight, maybe borrow a friend's computer.
I can use my husband's.
Yeah, just do that.
yeah, you'll break his computer too, and then he'll be, he'll be thrilled.
Well, no, so I figured out this was a problem because at first I thought, oh, well, it's just maybe there's something wrong with the homework assignment. So I did use his computer to download it, and it worked fine. I was like, okay. And then I tried to open something else for another homework, and I was like, oh, nothing's working. Okay, cool.
Interesting.
Yeah, try and Google that. However you download it.
If you don't get a resolution on that by Thursday, bring it by my office. We'll track it down.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Parker.
So, question for you.
Yeah.
With the on-air